Hi everyone, and welcome to another crime and punishment story. This week I am covering the story of Thomas Richardson and the murder of John Hart in Newcastle Upon Tyne on November the 9th, 1878. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you're new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. I have not been able to find very much information for either men from their earlier lives, so the information about them will be sadly quite basic. Thomas Richardson was born in around 1850, no location is given, and in 1878 he was said to be around 29 years old and was a miner working at Wardley Colliery. His parents lived in Scotswood Road in Newcastle. Thomas was said to be married and lived with his wife at Wardley. However, the name of his wife is unknown, and it is also not known if he had any children. John Hart, the victim, was born in around 1857, possibly in Hexham, to parents James and Magdalene. In 1878 he was said to be just 21 years old and was a miner living in Callerton with his parents and also working at Callerton Colliery. On the morning of Saturday the 9th of November 1878, John, his mother and his sister travelled to Newcastle from Callerton as John wanted to buy some boots and a hat, and his mother and sister also had some shopping to do. During the afternoon they lost contact with each other, and his sister and mother went back home, and John went to his uncle's house in Elsick Street. There he had some tea, and then with two other men who had been at the house by the names of James Patterson and Frank Campbell, John and his uncle Mark headed out for a drink at the nearby Goat Inn. They did not stop here for long, only having one drink before deciding to go to the Queen's Arms. The Queen's Arms was run by a man by the name of Mr. Ramsay, and he was playing the fiddle as the men went inside. John Hart decided that he would dance along to the tune that Ramsay was playing. A few short moments later, Thomas Richardson entered the pub. Thomas knew John from having worked with him in the past, and at first the men seemed friendly enough to each other, but then an argument broke out over who was the better dancer. Thomas got quite angry, and in the end Mr. Ramsay asked him to leave the pub, which he did. However, it seems that he did not go far, and a few moments later John and the other men went outside and saw Thomas was still there, so they ended up going back inside. Thomas then also came back into the Queen's Arms and resumed his argument, only for Mr. Ramsay to ask him to leave again. John, his uncle, and the other two men left the pub a short while later. When they got into the street, they found that Thomas was still outside, waiting for them. It would seem that he wished to continue the argument. However, John wanted to put an end to it, so he invited Thomas to the Goat Inn for a drink. Thomas refused, and the two men argued briefly for a few more moments, before Thomas, who was now standing a short distance away from John, shouted to him to come down here and I will fettle you. John was angered by this and told his uncle that he would go and see what he wanted. As John got within a few yards of Thomas, Thomas rushed forward and without saying a word struck John twice in the left breast and once on the side. John immediately fell to the ground and Thomas ran away down Westgate Road. Mark Hart went to his side, and it was then that he discovered that John had been stabbed in the chest and side. Frank Campbell had ran after Thomas, but after only following him for a short time, he returned to the side of John Hart and helped to carry him to the home of his uncle in Elsick Street, where they then called for the doctor and the police. P.C. Monk was given a description of Thomas Richardson and details of the area where he lived, and he immediately went out to look for him. Dr. William I. Anson was called to the house and arrived a little after 9 p.m. He found that Dr. Macaulay and Dr. Baumgartner were already in attendance. All three men believed there was little that could be done for John, and between them they stitched up the wounds to his chest, and he was put to bed. Dr. Ianson stayed with him for about an hour before leaving, and on returning the next morning at about 10 a.m. he found that John Hart was already dead. PC Monk found Thomas Richardson in Wardley at around 8:40 a.m. on the Sunday morning. He found him in the street near to his home. At the time of his initial arrest, John was still alive, so he was arrested for unlawfully wounding, to which he replied that he knew nothing about it. However, by the time he had been taken to Westgate Police Station, it was known that John had died. And when Thomas was told this, he replied by saying, "This is a bad job for me if he is." He was now arrested for willful murder. And on searching his clothing, PC Monk found a pocket knife in his trousers which appeared to be covered in blood. The inquest was held at the Durham Ox Inn in Newcastle before Coroner Hoyle. James Hart, miner at Callerton Colliery, said that John Hart was his son. He stated that on November the 9th his son had left home to go to Newcastle in perfect health. He said he was told that something was wrong at midnight of the same day. He then travelled to Newcastle and the home of his brother Mark, where he found his son lying in bed in a dying state. He said he had stayed with him until 5:20 a.m. when he had died. He stated that he had known Thomas Richardson for around 12 years, having first met him when he worked at Elsick Colliery, where his son had also worked at the same time. He said the two men had been on friendly terms. And although he had not seen Thomas for several years, at the time that he had last seen him, he had found him to be a quiet, decent sort of a lad. He said his son John was very fond of dancing and prided himself on his skill as a dancer. A suggestion was made that John had attacked Thomas and caused him to have two black eyes. Thomas had appeared at the inquest with these black eyes still evident. However, as you will see from the evidence given at the inquest, no one seemed to see or know anything about this. Thomas Ramsey, landlord of the Queen's Arms, said he had known Thomas Richardson for about a year and a half. He had always found him to be a quiet and inoffensive man. He said on the night in question, Thomas had arrived some time after John. He believed that both men had been drinking prior to entering his public house, but did not feel that either of them were incapable. He said that he had heard the two men arguing about dancing, with one, though he was not sure who, stating that they were a better dancer than the other. Because of this argument, he had at first tried to keep them apart. When this did not work, he had asked Thomas to leave. He stated that John and his friends had left at the same time, and he felt that they were leaving with the intention to fight with Thomas, but they had returned almost immediately, and that a few moments later Thomas had returned and the argument had resumed inside the pub. Again he had asked Thomas to leave, and he claimed that before he left, John had asked him to shake hands as if to end the argument. The others, he said, left soon afterwards, and he did not see any of the men again. When asked, he said when Thomas came back into the pub the second time, he did not notice any issues with his eyes. They did not look red as if he had been fighting, and he did not see John strike him at any time. John Turpin said that he lived on Westgate Road near to the Goat Inn. He said he had been outside of his home on Saturday night and had seen the two men in the street. He said that he had heard Thomas shout to John to come down here and I will fettle you. He saw John walk towards Thomas and appear to make a grab for him. He then saw Thomas strike out at him, but he was too far away to see if Thomas had a knife in his hand or not. He said he did not see John Hart strike Thomas about the face in such a way as to cause any black eyes. John Turpin went on to say that he had been walking down the road behind them to see what was going on, and when he saw John Hart fall and Thomas run away, he went straight over and attempted to lift John from the ground. When doing this, he found his clothing to be covered in blood, and he was the first to realise that John Hart had been stabbed in the chest. He stated that he had known Thomas by sight for around 2 years, but he did not know his name. He had never seen him get into any fights, and he had always seemed a quiet man to him. Dr. Ianson, who lived at 230 Westgate Road, said he had been called to the house of Mark Hart on the night of November the 9th to see the patient John Hart. He spoke of stitching the wounds, as has been previously mentioned, and he also spoke of how he believed that some considerable force had been used to inflict the wounds. He said that the cause of death for John Hart had been one stab wound which had punctured the lung and another which had punctured the heart, causing severe internal bleeding. P.C. Monk said that he had acted on information that had been given to him about Thomas on Saturday evening, and he had found him near to his home in Wardley early the following morning. He said he had told Thomas that he wanted him for the stabbing of a man at Newcastle, and Thomas had replied by saying, "It will be amazing if I have, I don't know anything about it." He said he then told him that he would have to come back to Newcastle with him, and that it was on their arrival that they found out about the death of John Hart, and Thomas was then charged with wilful murder. He said that Thomas had later said that he could not say anything about it, as he knew nothing about it, nothing at all. I did not find any details of any evidence given by Mark Hart, James Patterson or Frank Campbell at the inquest, but the coroner's statement may explain this. The coroner addressed the jury, stating that he felt no need to call any further witnesses, as only John Turpin had seen the blows inflicted, the others only seeing John Hart lying on the ground afterwards or arguing with Thomas earlier. He felt that there was only one verdict they could consider, and that was one of wilful murder. The jury at the inquest, without retiring, returned a verdict of wilful murder against Thomas Richardson, and he was committed for trial. Unfortunately, I was unable to find any details of the funeral of John Hart, but the funeral details are not always reported, especially if they are just smaller family funerals. The trial took place in Newcastle in January of 1879 before Mr. Joseph Lopez. When asked how he pleaded, Thomas replied not guilty in a very clear, loud voice. The majority of the evidence given at the trial was the same as that at the inquest. However, Thomas Ramsay of the Queen's Arms now made the suggestion that on the first occasion that Thomas was asked to leave the pub, the other men had followed him out and had been fighting with him. He stated that on their return they had said, "We have given him plenty, he will not want to fight any more." He also now added that when Thomas had come back into the pub the second time, he had noticed that his coat was torn, and that Thomas had said he had been badly used by the parties who had followed him out. When asked by the judge why he had changed his statement, he said that he believed he had previously stated that Thomas had complained of his coat being torn, but he did not remember that he had not stated that Thomas had complained of being badly used. Mark Hart stated that John had been dancing when Thomas came into the Queen's Arms. He felt Thomas had been drinking quite a lot, and he said that he could dance better than John. He said the two men had argued and Thomas had been asked to leave. He said that John and Campbell went outside behind Thomas and he himself had stood on the doorstep. He said he did not see Thomas outside and he quickly went back inside, as did the other two men, and that he did not hear anyone say, "We have given him plenty, he will not want to fight any more." He went on to say that after Thomas had been asked to leave the second time, they all left shortly afterwards. When Thomas shouted for John to go down to him, he had told him not to go, but he still decided to go towards him. He did not see any blows struck, but he saw John fall and Thomas run away. He said that after this, with the help from some other men in the area, they had carried John to his house in Elsick Street and sent for the doctor and the police. James Patterson said he lived in Wallsend and had visited Mark Hart on November the 9th and had been with him, John Hart and Frank Campbell at the Queen's Arms. He gave very similar evidence to that of Mark Hart, also stating that he had not heard anyone say, "We have given him plenty, he will not want to fight anymore." He said when they left the Queen's Arms he had stopped near the Goat Inn to talk to a young woman and had not seen anything that had taken place between John and Thomas, and did not actually see John again until he went to Mark Hart's house later that night, by which time John was in a dying state on the bed with a doctor in attendance. He said they had all had a couple of drinks but did not think that anyone was drunk, and he also went on to say that he was the cousin of John Hart. Frank Campbell said he lived in Newcastle and had also gone to the Queen's Arms with Mark, John and James. He said that Thomas had been asked to leave the pub twice, but unlike the other two men, he claimed that no one had followed him outside the first time. He said he did not hear Thomas state that he had been ill-used by anyone or that his coat had been torn. When they all left the pub, he said he saw John fall, but did not see what had happened before this. He said he ran after Thomas and called him a coward, but he was not able to catch up with him. John Rutherford said he was the publican of the Hodgson's Arms in Newcastle. He stated that on November the 9th, Thomas had been drinking in his pub. He had briefly been fighting with a man known only by the name of Roy. He said he was not sure if Thomas had been hit near his eyes or if this fight had caused his coat to be torn. The prosecution stated that Thomas had immediately on entering the pub and seeing John dancing began to ridicule him. It had been this that had started the two men's argument. John had attempted to make friends by shaking hands, but Thomas said he would not do this. He went on to say that on leaving the Queen's Arms, that the witnesses Patterson, Campbell and John's Uncle Mark had all said there had been no further argument between the two men outside, so much so that they had all walked further down the road together before Thomas walked on a little after refusing the offer of a drink. He stated that there was no provocation outside of the pub from John Hart or any of the other men in the party, and if there had been any from earlier that evening, when they had all been inside the pub, then Thomas had had ample time to cool down. He said that he believed that Thomas was well aware of what he had done when he stabbed John, which was the main reason he had ran away immediately afterwards. He said that in his opinion it had been an unprovoked attack with no motive, and there was no other verdict to be reached than one of guilty of willful murder. Thomas Richardson did not give any evidence on his own behalf. The defence stated that although he did not believe the witnesses had come to court to tell anything other than the truth, many of those who stated there was no fighting between Thomas and the other men outside of the pub were family, so they may not have told all they really knew. He said it was for the jury to decide if they believed the new details from the publican of the Queen's Arms, who said the men had spoken of fighting with Thomas earlier in the evening, or if they believed the evidence of those family members who said they had not been fighting with Thomas at all. He said he hoped that the jury would find something in this case that would cause them to find Thomas guilty only of manslaughter. The judge, in his summing up, stated that there was no doubt that the death of John Hart had been caused by Thomas Richardson. It was, however, for the jury to decide if there had been provocation or not, and if they believed this was manslaughter or murder. He discussed in great length the difference between manslaughter and murder. The jury retired for around 30 minutes, and on their return they found Thomas Richardson guilty of willful murder. When asked if he had anything to say to this, Thomas made no reply. The judge then sentenced Thomas to death by hanging, and that his remains would be buried within the grounds of Newcastle Prison. As Thomas was taken from the dock, he looked up to the gallery and said, "Goodbye, all." Almost immediately after the trial, the solicitor working on behalf of Thomas began a petition for a reprieve and for the sentence to be one of penal servitude for life. mainly based on his feeling that the jury had not followed the judge's direction when he had discussed the difference between murder and manslaughter, and he felt that Thomas should not have been found guilty of murder. Several petitions were signed, including one in the village of Wardley, which had been signed by several hundred people, and another that had been signed by the Mayor of Newcastle and several members of the legal profession. By the end of January 1879, a letter was received from the Home Secretary stating that a respite for Thomas Richardson had been granted, and his sentence would now be commuted to penal servitude for life. This information was said to be received with great gladness by Thomas himself. I was unfortunately unable to find any details of where Thomas was sent to serve out his sentence, although a man who fitted his age and northeast location was in prison in Kent in 1881, but this may have just been a coincidence, and I was also unable to find any details of his wife and what happened to her after he was sent to prison. Sadly, it isn't always possible to find this kind of information. I found this to be another strange story. Once again, it does seem to have been caused by drinking, but also seems to have been over something quite trivial, like one man suggesting that he was a better dancer than the other. It is also worth remembering, though, that Thomas had already been in a fight earlier that evening, so he may have simply been looking for someone else to cause an argument with, and going out of his way to look for another fight. And I did also wonder if the two men had actually been as friendly as people thought, or had they had a recent fallout over something else that others had not been aware of, which would have made the dancing argument much worse than it should have been, as it truly seemed to be an argument that was not worth the taking the life of another man over. But whatever the reason, it was a tragic loss of a young man who was only 21 years old, with all of his life still ahead of him. But what do you think? Was Thomas simply looking for another fight, and John was in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or do you believe that when Thomas was first put out of the pub, that the other men had followed and attacked him, and this was why he ended up taking his revenge by stabbing John, who he had had the initial argument with? And was it right for his sentence to be reduced from murder to manslaughter, and then to be sent to prison for life? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.